And welcome to Straight Up. I am Mark Petroni, your host. Much ado about nothing? Well, the Prime Minister announces a list of major building projects to be considered for fast-track approval. The list focused almost entirely on critical minerals and energy. The glaring issue is foreign ownership, particularly of the LNG project, for instance. Billions of dollars will be spent in tax money to bankroll construction of a U.S. company, U.S.-owned company, and will largely be built in Asia using Chinese steel. Let's listen.
As it stands, Western LNG is the owner of the Xilisms terminal, and it would be built in Korea with Korean and Chinese steel. So how much taxpayer money are we prepared to invest in a project that is American-owned and foreign-built?
There are different aspects of the project, as I said. There is the PRGT pipeline, which is necessary, which is Canadian-owned, First Nation. Sorry, can I finish? There is the associated transmission line that comes there. There are structures that come with projects that ensure that there's returns to taxpayers through the tax system as well.
The question is obvious. Are Canadians going to be the main beneficiaries of these projects, or will it be corporate friends and the Prime Minister himself who are the real winners here? Lorne Gunter has some thoughts, and he'll be joining us shortly. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre notes the Prime Minister is really just re-announcing projects that were unveiled years ago during the Trudeau government's time in office. Let's listen.
Yet again today, instead of getting things done, Mark Carney was standing up doing photo ops, announcing that he's going to approve a bunch of projects that were already going to happen. One of them, the Sisson mine in the East Coast. This mine, there was a Liberal minister, Dominic LeBlanc, who said that his government was going to make sure this project got underway within a year, and that was back in 2017. Now today, Mark Carney is re-announcing that same Liberal promise.
There were no new pipeline projects announced, included in Carney's announcement, which is a major priority for the province of Alberta, a pipeline through northern British Columbia, a project opposed by the NDP government of that province. Poilievre expects the Prime Minister will use BC Premier David Eby as an excuse to block pipeline projects that he wants to block anyway. Let's listen.
The federal government needs to do one thing to unlock our resources, and that is get out of the way. The provinces should have exclusive control over permitting projects that are within one province, and the federal government has exclusive control over projects that travel between provinces. And this latter point is very good because, some people say, well, David Eby is going to oppose a pipeline from Alberta to the Pacific. And my answer to that is, who cares? He has no power to block an interprovincial pipeline. It is a federal responsibility. So Mark Carney will try to use David Eby as an excuse for not allowing a pipeline to go ahead. That is not an excuse.
With so much negative media attention focused on Pierre Poilievre's leadership style, some are wondering if reporters are ignoring the real story. Conservative strategist Sebastian Skamsky says the legacy media should be more focused on the opposition to the budget inside the Liberal caucus itself. Here he is on CTV's Power Play with that.
Let's remember why all of this has been sparked. It's about the prospect of the budget not passing. When you have a former minister putting out a very polished video describing the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Liberal budget, I think it begs a lot of questions, and I think it should command a lot more media attention. I would recommend, your colleagues Vashi at the Toronto Star or the CBC to knock on his door and ask a bit more about whether Mr. Carney can find the votes in his own caucus for his own budget.
We have word, by the way, that former Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont is upset after getting booed at a Remembrance Day event in Nova Scotia this week. What did he expect would happen? I'm now joined by senior political columnist Lorne Gunter, who is with the Edmonton Sun. Welcome, Lorne.
Hey, thanks very much, Mark.
You heard the announcement yesterday. Some people are describing it as underwhelming. Others are noting that there's an element of concern here around who owns what. I mean, Canadian taxpayers are going to be on the hook for billions in terms of construction costs. And when you look at the ties to who owns some of these companies, like the LNG firm that was announced yesterday in that announcement, some are wondering who's going to be the major beneficiary here. Is it going to be the Americans, maybe the Chinese? Do you have any issues around that?
Yeah, for sure I do. I mean, I particularly have issues if the Chinese are going to be the main beneficiaries. I don't worry as much about the Americans because their involvement in the energy sector in Canada has been big from the beginning. We probably wouldn't have an energy sector if it weren't for the Americans. But it would be nice to see more of that capital stay in Canada. One of the big problems that we have, I think, in Canada is that we don't have capital formation. We don't have big pots of capital that people can go to with big ideas and have it funded in the country. And part of the reason for that is we've had a lot of foreign ownership, but I resist limits on foreign ownership. I'm old enough to remember FIRA, the Foreign Investment Review Agency, back when Trudeau Sr. was in office. And it just undercut all sorts of projects because there wasn't enough Canadian involvement. And so I'm reluctant to do that sort of thing. But I'm also convinced that this announcement yesterday, and especially the one in September with the first five, is basically just a PR exercise. I don't think that they really intend to get much of this built. And much of it, especially in the first five, those projects are already underway. Three of them are almost half finished. So, what is the federal government going to do other than come in and maybe lavish a few $1 billion on them?
Yeah. And as Pierre Poilievre noted, one of them was announced in 2017. It was
Yes.
supposed to have been going within a year of that. And here we are re-announcing that same thing. So, you have to wonder exactly what Carney is thinking, whether people have forgotten about those previous announcements or whether people thinking that this was something special and new. But I guess he had to announce something, right? He was under a lot of pressure to do so. Interestingly enough, we have Enbridge announcing something here. This looks more substantial, 1.4 billion US in terms of an expansion of its pipeline. And that will mean more a heavy oil crude headed south of the border. Can you maybe give us your take on that?
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's a good announcement. In other ways, it doesn't solve our major problem, which is we don't have enough foreign buyers for our heavy oil. And so we have to sell it to the Americans at a discount. They know they're our only customer. And so they force deals with us that reflect that. We send them oil at probably about the discount's a little bit less since the Trans Mountain expansion opened up in May of last year, but it's still around 12%. And what they do with it is they have 25 refineries in the Midwest in the United States. 24 of them are built to handle heavy oil from Canada. And so they process oil from Canada in the Midwest for domestic consumption around the United States. And then they take their light sweet crude, like their West Texas Intermediate, and they sell it internationally at a premium. So this is one of the reasons I always chafed at the idea that Trump was spitting out at the beginning of the year that they had a trade deficit with us, because what we were doing was funding this enormous profit that they were making off of their light sweet crude. So, Enbridge is great. Let them ship more oil to the States. It's 1.4 private billion dollars that's going into it. It's not public money. But I think it's also one of the reasons why Enbridge is less keen to get into a pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast, because they're already expecting to make this big investment in existing pipelines.
And speaking of that pipeline to the coast, I mean, there was no new pipeline obviously announced. I don't think there was a huge shock to anybody, but there is talk of this imminent agreement between the feds and Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, that we're going to see some kind of agreement coming up or movement forward in terms of projects involving specifically Alberta and energy. Is that going to happen, do you think? And to what degree does yesterday's announcement maybe put a damper on that?
Well, take a look. I think what we're talking about here is probably a two-step process for Alberta, and that is they're going to try and sign a memorandum of understanding with Ottawa about what would be needed to build a pipeline. And the talk out here is that they'll have to go big into carbon capture in order to get the Greens in the Liberal Party to agree to let them sell oil to the rest of the world. Well, but the International Energy Agency came out earlier this week and said if oil demand in the world is going to go up until 2050. You can have all these fantasies about the great transition or about replacing oil with wind and solar, whatever it is. Oil demand is going to go up for at least another 25 years. And so it would make sense for us to sell our conflict-free oil to the rest of the world. But there's such a green mafia in the federal government that they want us to promise there won't be any carbon coming out of that oil. So they want us to have these big carbon capture projects, and then maybe they'll decide that we can have a pipeline. But that's just a memorandum of understanding. To be really considered a real project, and I'm not even sure this is true, but to be considered a real nation-building project, you got to get on the list. And so even if we get a memorandum of understanding, we're still not on Carney's list. So, I think this is a delaying tactic in a lot of ways by the federal government.
Which is kind of what Pierre Poilievre was talking about when he said that the Premier Eby in British Columbia, of course, has continued to be in opposition of that pipeline, the Northern Gateway style. I realize it would be called something else, presumably, if it's reintroduced.
Right. Yeah, I think so too.
He doesn't want that to happen. And you've got potentially this kabuki theater happening between him and Carney, who may be using the intransigence by the New Democrat premier in Alberta or in BC to say, hey, I can't do this. I'd like to, Premier Smith, but, you've got BC next door and, we can't move forward, despite the fact that it's the feds really who have jurisdiction on a project like that.
That's right. The Constitution gives the feds the right to put a pipeline. It doesn't say pipelines in the Constitution, but it says interprovincial trade routes. And so that's a pipeline. And that's what that was the power that they used to get Trans Mountain to go through. Was, over BC's objections was, no, constitutionally it was ours to say, yes, it gets to go ahead. But I do think Carney's going to do that. And whenever you're talking about Liberals, you have to consider the electoral math. They always worry about their reelection. Everything they do is driven by how many votes they can get out of it. And they have 20 seats in BC, and they have 2 in Alberta. And the 2 in Alberta always are hanging by a thread. So their calculation about where they could get more seats, where they need to protect their seats, always comes back to BC over Alberta. And so I think, as you correctly point out, Carney's going to use Eby as an excuse for not giving a pipeline to Alberta.
Yeah, sounds pretty disingenuous. I mean, especially given all the talk of growing the economy. I mean, we're in a recession right now. We could really use a project like that. And the fact that we're not moving forward to it, it's troubling because there are other political considerations around Premier Smith in Alberta. I mean, she's got to look like she's playing hardball with the feds. And if, she is seen as kind of accepting this MOU with the feds that doesn't really cover the bases in terms of what Albertans want, I mean, could she be in trouble amongst her supporters?
She could. I think where they're really in trouble, if it gets to that, would be a breakaway group that goes to the right of where the UCP is. They're not in much danger of support shifting over to the NDP because the NDP would be as pro-green as the Fed. So that doesn't solve the problem. But if the vote splits on the right, we saw that happen in 2015, then you elect an NDP government. And so I'm sure she's very, very conscious of that, and she has to She has to do everything she can to keep that split from happening. So she's talking now about having sensitive negotiations with the feds. She's talking about they're still talking, and she's trying to convince those of us who are very skeptical about the Liberals that we should hold off criticizing her because something's coming.
Well,
so is Christmas, as they say.
well, there could be a referendum coming as well.
They're good.
From what I hear, maybe, but we'll have to see, because of course she's under great pressure. You talk about the right wing party maybe coming, forming out of dissatisfaction with what Smith has done and ongoing intransigence at the federal level. I mean, to what degree would the independence movement in Alberta benefit from having the feds not come through on this pipeline commitment?
Big time. I've said since the talk about separation after the April election, there was a lot of talk coming out of Alberta that we might have a separatist movement. I kept saying it's not going to prove to be a real threat until Ottawa does something concrete to upset Alberta, and rejecting a pipeline would be one of those things. So, I think there's a possibility. Would it be 55% of the electorate? Would there be a successful referendum to separate? I don't see that at the moment. But could it take away 15 to 20% of the UCP's support, and in the process elect the NDP? I think that's a real possibility.
So you're saying that this independence movement will run as a party in the next election?
Well, I think they have to. It's all well and good to go around and set up rallies and talk about taking back Alberta and being independent of the feds. But if you look at what happened in Quebec, you have to follow that example, and that was the Parti Québécois finally got elected. They ran as a party. They did an election or two where they didn't win, and then they won. And I think you have to form a party. There is this thing called the Republican Party of Alberta, which is an independence movement. It got next to no votes in a by-election in an area where it should do very well. So I think they have to find a different name. I think they have to find a different leader. But if somebody who's currently in the legislature and has a little bit of name recognition provincially decides they want to become the leader of a separatist party, it could happen.
Yeah, and I guess the fear then becomes, could the NDP be the beneficiary of that split?
Oh, for sure.
And you spoke about that earlier, and you've got this kind of urban-rural split in Alberta as well, where you've got most of the left-leaning votes concentrated in the cities, where you're talking about Edmonton and Calgary to a degree. And so then much of the support for independence and perhaps a right of UCP party is going to come in maybe the rural parts, the ranchers and the drillers and oil workers and all that kind of thing. So you've got potentially a lot of chaos in store.
Oh, for sure.
If
absolutely.
it doesn't navigate this properly and carefully.
Yep. I think that's a very prescient review of what's going to happen in Alberta in the next 3 or 4 years. Smith she's walking a tightrope. I mean, to some extent, so is Carney. I think Carney has a big green caucus within the Liberal Party that he has to deal with if he wants to keep that caucus from drifting back to the NDP. I mean, the only way that Conservatives win nationally if the NDP are strong, because they steal enough votes from the Liberals, the Conservatives can come up the middle. It's the same thing in Alberta, but in reverse. The only way that the NDP can win is if the vote on the right is split, and then they can come up. Well, that's exactly what happened in 2015. I remember getting in a debate with a political scientist, and I said, look, if you just put the Wild Rose and the PC vote together, they'd be 52%, and they overwhelm the NDP. And then this political scientists said, oh, it's not that easy. It's not clear that the PCs could get together with reform. So Jason Kenney came along, put the two parties together, and they got 53% of the vote. So it was as simple as all of that. So the only way the NDP can win is if Smith can't hold her coalition together. And that's a real possibility if Ottawa starts making a mess of all of this.
And it is interesting, as long as you mentioned Ottawa, that they didn't, despite the collapse of the NDP in the last election, the Liberals could not muster up enough to get a majority. I mean, they came close.
Yep.
But then you look at the Conservative vote, which was at 41.5%. I mean, most years, you and I know, that would be, that would be enough for a majority government. You'd be off to the races with 41.5% of the vote.
Harper won his majority in 2011 with just a little more than 41.5%.
And so here, we have to wonder what's going to happen with these. There's a lot of uncertainty in Ottawa. I mean, around this budget. I mean, you've heard all the talk around opposition within the Liberal ranks, some of the whining by some of those who think that there's not enough money allocated for, climate initiatives. Are you buying into that? I mean, could the Liberals find themselves at the wrong end of a confidence vote here around the budget?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the only people who would benefit from a snap election are the Liberals. So if the NDP are smart, they will get their tiny little caucus into a minivan and go across the river to Hull and have some beers while the vote's going on, because abstentions would push the Liberals over the top too. The NDP aren't ready. They're in the middle of a leadership race. They have no money. They're expecting about a $12 million refund from the federal government for the election expenses they've spent, but that's not going to come right away. So, you can borrow against that, I guess, but they're in real trouble. They don't want to go. And I have to say that I don't think the Conservatives are ready for it either. I mean, I don't think there's any more discontent in the Conservative caucus than there is in the Liberal caucus. But Poilievre is just not popular enough yet with voters, particularly voters in Ontario, to beat Carney out. It would be a better race because Trump isn't flapping his gums during the middle of the race and pushing people to Carney. But people just like Carney as a prime minister. They think he looks like a prime minister. And if they're not paying close attention, and they're not, then he will win. He'll get his majority. So I think the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP have to do whatever they can to keep the Liberals from losing the budget vote and forcing an early election.
So you're saying the Liberals could engineer their own defeat?
Of course.
Oh, wow, is this, this is not us.
That's what they did in 74. You remember under Trudeau, there was a majority government in 68 and a minority government in 72. And then in 74, they went out and they ran and won a majority. They engineered their defeat in 74 to force an election. And then they went around during the campaign saying, oh, the NDP, they caused this election. It's not our fault. You have to give us a majority, because if we don't have a majority, then the NDP can keep doing this to us. And they would do exactly the same thing now.
Yeah, I think that has something to do with wage and price controls. It
did?
Stanfield. Trudeau said, no, not us. And then he went ahead and did it after he
did it anyway. Mm-hmm.
Lauren, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
You bet, Mark.
Lauren Gunter. And that is it for this edition of Straight Up. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. Let's do it again real soon, shall we? Bye-bye for now.